areas of study because that affects the flow of the ice.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I'm the last one, Brendan.
Save the tallest for last.
Yeah, I do.
It's going to be a little tricky doing this because I normally draw people's attention to a couple posters. So if everyone can kind of squeeze in here, or just, we have the tree ring lab, and I think everyone has an appreciation of what we do on the simplest level, and that's the idea that trees produce a ring every year, that flush of growth, and it sounds really nice and simple, so you get the concept pretty easily, right? That every year there's that flush of growth, and depending on the way the climate goes in a given year, it'll either diminish or enhance the growth of that tree during that year. And that information is useful for us. And that at its simplest level is this right here. This is a conifer ring. I apologize for those who have to crane necks, but here's the edge of one ring. You can off my glasses. And the growth is going in this direction, and you get this sort of thickening of cells as you get to the end of the year. And I'm sure some of you guys are probably having your basic biology class. And do you know why those rings thicken toward the end of the year?
Because the tree loses its leaves, right? It has to survive.
It does that, but this is a process that's related to that.
It's the aging of the timing of stuff. It's time for them to shut down.
It is time for the shutdown, so why would it be to their advantage to
Conserve.
conserve what though?
Months that they don't have.
Well, that's part of it. This is a different function. Okay, remember, this is the anatomy of the stem. So think about what the stem is doing. Right, you have this structure of the tree that's connected from the leaves all the way down to the roots, and in that whole system is what?
Nourishment.
Nourishment through
water.
what? Liquid.
Yeah, water.
Right, fluids.
Chlorophyll.
So everything that takes place from the leaves to the roots, it's all connected.
Water.
And so water is the critical element there. And there's a couple of different factors that affect the water in trees depending on where in the world these trees have evolved to be. And I'll give you a couple examples, right? When we work in the Arctic, in Labrador is where I work, or Alaska, you'll get the control on growth here will be temperature. So at the end of the year, that the cells are formed and then they start to thicken, and they thicken for a very particular reason in the Arctic. It's to prevent freeze damage of the tracheid cells. So you think of any liquid that's within those interstitial holes in the cells, they'll rupture. And what happens if those cells rupture is that the next year the fluid transport that conduit is broken. And it can actually kill the tree if it's severe enough. And we have, I apologize, we're in disarray. I'm in the process of getting new posters made that'll explain this in better detail. But you can see years that have been big volcanic years, where the season is shut down and gotten cold early. The trees didn't have a chance to lignify and the cells rupture, and it leaves this mark of these ruptured tracheid cells, and it's very distinct. And we use that as a dating guide. The other reason, if you can think of, if you're in, let's say, a tropical environment or a very arid environment, why would you want to lignify cells there?
Because you have to conserve your water.
You have to conserve the water, and think about drinking from a soda straw. If you have a straw that's 6 inches in diameter, trying to drink through that, you couldn't do it, right?
The shake versus the water.
That's right. So you're trying to maintain the integrity of the hydraulic conductivity of the stem. That's the most critical thing for the plant. And so we use a lot of information in trees, and I was going to say the first one is how many cells are developed in the course of a year. In a very poor year, you might only have a couple of cells that form. There might be very minimal cells developed, and then if it's a particularly rapid shutdown to the end of the growth season, you'll have a light density ring or insufficient amount of lignin. And here's an example of one here. Here's one that has more lignin and thicker cells. And so these are secondary processes that take place. The cells form, and then the lignin is put in afterwards. And so you think about it, in a good year, the tree has a lot of chance to protect itself, and in a poor year, it doesn't. That's kind of a different way of looking at it from what we normally did. We just said if the ring is wide, it was a good year, and if it was narrow, it was a bad year. And those two things are true. So you can have a narrow ring with a thick latewood band because it had ample time to shut down, but the overall year was bad. Or you can have the opposite be the case as well. And so the reason I bring that up is because I've been using wood anatomy more and more lately, rather than just the width of the ring, which is the simplest measurement. And from that information, we started to do things like be able to reconstruct the climate of the past. And with tree rings, anyone have any idea what the oldest tree on the planet is? How many years old?
Over
5,000.
5,000. Good. You must have read about the Prometheus tree
The one
in Nevada.
on a mountain, a hill overlooking the ocean.
Well, there's some, the oldest tree ever found, it actually has a name. It's the Prometheus tree, is what they called it. And it's on Wheeler Peak in Nevada. It's a bristlecone pine, and it's 5,000 years old. You know how we know it's 5,000 years old? How?
How many rings it has?
That's right. How do we know how many rings it had?
Like,
You probably don't know the stories. It's a trick
Because
question.
down the road.
They cut it down to look. The oldest tree ever found is cut down and killed. And it's a tragedy of a story. There was a graduate student from North Carolina that was doing his research. And interestingly, he was interested in the Little Ice Age, which is only a few hundred years ago, right? So he got his increment core stuck in the tree. So the increment core is this little item right here. And figure this is 1964 when this is taking place, so it was pretty remote in the mountains of Nevada at that time. It's one of these. This is what we take the core samples of trees with. So it's the simple device. We carry it in. It takes a little bit of elbow grease, and it just fits in. It's got a cutting tip on the ends there. It's very sharp, so be careful to touch that. And then we'll just drill it into the tree by hand, and then we use this extracting spoon to slide under the core, and when we twist it back, it breaks it off, and it comes right out in the straw. And so it ends up looking like these. Pass a couple of these around so you can take a look at them. This is what our core samples look like. And so we mount those on these wooden sticks, and from that we can analyze it in a number of ways. And so this guy, his name is Curry, the guy that cut down the oldest living thing in town.
You weren't joking. Yeah.
He actually did. In fairness, he had no idea that it would be the oldest. They just assumed there were a lot of, it looked old, they knew it was old. You can actually, if you go to Wheeler Peak and you know where to look, the tree's still there. The stump of it is still there, and the top of it, and I need to make a picture that I put on a poster. Nevada. It's on Wheeler Peak, and it's now Great Basin National Park. At the time, it was designated as, I think it was BLM land when he went and did that. And so that record, though, because there were so many other trees that died and just were still on the landscape, by taking cross sections of the trees that were already dead, they were able to piece back a record that goes more than 10,000 years.
Wow.
Because it preserves so well. So when I did my PhD thesis, I worked in a place called Tasmania, and the island off the south of Australia. And I worked with this species. I'm gonna pass this around too, because this is really cool. Anyone have any idea how many rings would be in this tree? Let's take a guess. 1,000. That's a good guess. 1,700. Wow. The pith is here, and it grew in this direction. Anyone know why? You look like a smart kid. Why would that grow in one direction? Anyone?
The cooler side of the tree.
The wind?
It's growing up on a mountain in Tasmania. The roaring 40s blast through that area and hit it from the west. So that tree is growing from west to east, away from the prevailing dominant winds. And there were these little, I just found a bunch of pictures that are on top of this. I just found these today as we were cleaning this stuff. I'm gonna show this one around. So in 1966, a fire killed a bunch of this stand. You can pass this one around too and have a look at that. But that's how we found this site. It was the rare site of human pine. And they usually grow, we tried to work with them for dendro from low elevation. Here's some that I dug out of the Stanley River. And I can't remember if we actually had a date on this one. This was probably early Holocene.
No, we've seen it.
So this wood, it's a different family of conifers that grow only in the southern hemisphere initially. The Podocarpaceae, the originator there. This is only found in Tasmania. And I'm bringing this up because as you go higher in elevation, these trees became really sensitive to temperature. Because as they were sitting on top of the mountain, the growing season there, it usually snowed in every month of the year. It's kind of like being on Mount Washington or Mount Marcy in the Adirondacks. It was cold and windy. You can pass that around too. It has a beautiful smell to it, although it's hard to smell now because it's been exposed well. But if we cut it, you'd smell it. And we would pull these out of the mud that had been in there for 10,000 years. It would cut like fresh wood and have this beautiful smell of that. Thanks. Yeah, I apologize for the conditioning here for giving this talk, but it's like. So I want to just show one other thing to you here as we're looking at this. The most important part of this process of identifying the rings and determining which ones are narrow or wide or dense or less dense is assigning the exact calendar date to every ring in sequence. And it sounds easy, right? You can just count them back, and sometimes it works that way. But I've been working in places like Vietnam, and here's a cypress that lives to be about 1,200 years old. So I have records from Vietnam now that go back 1,000 years, 1,200 years. And you have all these what are called false rings and missing rings. And so false rings are rings where you have lignification, that process I just told you about. It commences in the middle of the growing season, and then it ceases and then goes back to normal growth. And why would that be? What can you think of that would?
A drought?
A drought, perfect. A drought or anything that triggers the tree to start shutting down. A big cold spell can do that. So it says the trigger is there in the tree's sort of memory to say, oh, it's time to start lignifying. And it'll start this and then it'll discontinue it. And those can be really tricky in the tropics. In Vietnam, there's big pulses of water from these tropical storms that can come in and the tree will initiate growth again. And so you have a lot of these issues that happen. And the other one is an absent ring, a missing ring. And this one's a little trickier to explain, but in a very poor year, there's a hormone called auxin, AUXIN, and auxin is created in the foliage, and it trickles down the outside of the stem, and that initiates the cambium to start dividing cells. And you can imagine in a really poor year, especially as the tree gets bigger, if there's too little auxin, there's going to leave bare patches on the stem. And that's exactly what it is. I have an analogy I use of a hot fudge sundae where you dump a bucket of hot chocolate on it. You'll cover the whole thing. But if you have a thimble full or a shot glass full, you'll have bare patches on the ice cream. And that's kind of the simplest analogy I can think of for that. And as a result, we very often have situations like this one here. All these red dots are areas where the ring is missing in sequence on that particular core. And we know this because we will take hundreds of cores and we'll match them in, and then the patterns are exact as you go along. And I had one core from this site that had 51 rings missing on one side of the stem. And so if it's one or two rings, it probably doesn't matter that much. You'll be able to easily pick them up. But in some of these, sometimes I just can't cross-date a site, especially those growing on limestone because they're so nutrient poor. And the water just disappears when it dries out. The trees put on many, many missing rings, and I just can't even make sense of them. So that's the big issue there. But we have gotten it to work with great effort, and we've produced records, terrestrial records of climate from the tropics that no one ever had before. And it just so happens that these are some of the most important records we had for things like the drought atlases that we've produced. And so I want to point your attention to these posters here, and if you have a chance on your own, if you're wandering around and you come in here, you can read these, but in short what we do is, I apologize because no one's going to be able to see this from the back, but here's a map of North America. All those red dots there are tree ring sites. And now there's even more of them. People have been collecting these for a century. And so we update them and we get the most recent years associated there. Very, very strong linkage to the hydroclimate of the region. And so we have a process where we interpolate on a gridded, as though there were a perfect grid over North America. We can reconstruct the drought metric for any single grid point across North America. And it's a couple thousand years in length. You can go online to the North American Drought Atlas or the Monsoon Asia Drought Atlas, and you can download a point anywhere you're interested in looking. And because of the work that this lab has done, you can actually determine how dry or wet it was over the past couple thousand years. And you can also see how well we did it at predicting or retrodicting that particular point. We do much better in some places than we do in others. There's big bare spots in the map where we don't have tree ring data from nearby. But we do a remarkably good job of capturing the fidelity in the metric, and we can extend this back years. That's probably the most important product that's come out of the tree ring lab, out of this lab, and probably I would argue of any of the labs around the world. We're the most active globally. We really travel everywhere that there's trees. Even places where there's trees in the past that are in the fossil record. I was just looking today at something that someone sent me from the Cretaceous, and there was this wood from Arkansas, and these piles of driftwood that had floated in 66 million years ago. And he took these thin sections, and sure enough, you could see it's metasequoia. You would see the beautiful rings, you see the tracheids cells, they look just like those images up there. So that just this morning I got them, so I'm kind of excited about looking at that. you know, there's so much more I could tell you. One more thing, and then I assume you guys will have some questions. My wife will tell you I could talk about this all day long. You guys are crazy. What do you think we're looking at here?
Looks like a brain.
Doesn't, my brain looks a little bit like that, right? You can kind of,
Big coloration, like a dark coloration.
do you see these marks here?
Yeah.
Anyone think, have an
Is
idea?
damaged by animals?
Damaged by something, what? Fire. Fire.
Oh.
These are fire scars, and this is, I can't remember, unfortunately, we've lost the information of where exactly this came from. I believe this was California. You can see it actually really well on this side too. I'm gonna pass this around. You can see the charcoal there,
Yeah.
right? And so, you'll notice there's a fairly regular occurrence of these fires. Anyone have any idea why it comes in these regular intervals?
It's a cycle, right?
It is a cycle.
Regenerate, new growth.
Well, it's a,
The dry months.
the dry months, so what would make a drought enhanced over the course of, let's say, about in the 11-year?
A drought and then dry stuff with
What do you read
lightning
about in the
strikes.
papers all the time about our climate? What dominates our climate stories?
Climate change, we get warmer.
Climate change, but over the course of the past 1,000 years, there was something that takes place regularly. What is it? And so, El Nino Southern Oscillation. So these El Nino, actually it's La Nina events in the American Southwest. So these, she had it right. So these La Nina events take place and it makes it very dry. There's a fuel loading that occurs. And these burns were very regular. And Native Americans initiated the burns, but we can date these and map these all over the western US. And they're very uniform, and you see these years of La Ninas, you'll see this beautiful occurrence of fires. And then around the end of the 19th century, they stopped. Why?
We started protecting the parklands.
Smokey the Bear.
That-
I blame Smokey. So once we started initiating this forest protection, we started putting forest fires out. The fuel load got really huge, but we suppressed fire for a while. And then what started happening, and I remember being in Yellowstone in, I think it was '87 when the big fire came through. When I was a master's student at the time. And the fuel loading got so great, when you had these fires, they just destroyed hectares and hectares of forest. And so that was an interesting story that's in those things of looking at these fire scars. So really anything that either kills or injures or affects the growth of these trees will leave its mark in there. And we're really kind of detectives telling what the story is. And there's a lot more that we do. We work with a lot of chemistry, stable isotopes like oxygen 18. And I don't think I want to bore you guys with that stuff today. Question?
What causes a pattern in a tree ring? I cut down trees and
For fun?
I said, give me to protect the house.
Yeah, yeah.
And this tree looks so gorgeous, I said, give me a slice. I took 2 slices. It almost looked like a Native American pattern.
What, was it a
Within
pattern of
this
the
ring.
rings or of the fungus inside? Sometimes it's a fungal, was it like a
I can bring it
coloration?
over.
I'd like to see that, yeah. Was it like a coloration?
If you can picture a Native American pattern of shapes, like diamonds or triangles, or even 5-sided and sequential, 5 in this ring.
One thing that one thing I do see a lot when culturally modified trees, I see this a lot in Southeast Asia because they gouge the pine trees to get the resin out of them.
This wasn't pine. This should be maple, if I remember.
Maple, okay. But I wonder if people tapped it but it could be injuries to the cambium and it would leave like a coloration stain. And especially if it's in a single ring, is it in 1 year?
It was several years ago, because it's in.
Yeah.
It's in by this much.
So when we cut things down a lot, I did a project in Queens, I was working all over the city, and one thing I kept, it was breaking increment cores on nails and things that were inside, because remember, the tree puts a whole new tree on every year.
Right.
The old one is no longer living tissue, it's just that cambium zone, so it's a whole new cone of growth. So anything that happened in the past will remain there.
Right.
And you're probably looking at scarring, I think, yeah,
2 slices.
interesting.
I left 1 outside to dry and 1 inside to dry.
Cool. Yeah,
We have to, we're out of time, Brendan.
nice to meet you all.
Thank you.